The cold wind howled through the empty streets as Ethan Walker pulled his coat tighter around his body. The city lights flickered in the distance, but they didn't shine for him. He had been walking for hours, his mind a battlefield of doubt and regret. 5 years. That's how long he had been chasing his dream of becoming a writer. 5 years of rejection letters, unopened emails, and polite dismissals. He had poured his soul onto pages that no one seemed to want. The passion that once burned brightly now flickered like a dying candle, threatened by the storm of failure. He stopped in front of a bookstore, the warm glow inside a stark contrast to the cold night. His reflection stared back at him from the glass tired eyes and unshaven stubble, telling the story of a man on the verge of giving up. Inside, rows of books lined the shelves, books written by people who had made it, people whose words mattered. He wanted to turn away, but something held him there. A memory surfaced, unbidden yet powerful. His mother's voice, soft yet firm. "Ethan, you don't fail until you stop trying." She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The bell jingled as he stepped inside, the scent of paper and ink filling his lungs. He had no idea why he had come in, perhaps to remind himself of what he was losing. "Can I help you?" a voice asked. Ethan turned to see an older man behind the counter, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He wore a kind smile, the kind that felt like warmth on a winter night. "I was just looking," Ethan replied. The man nodded. "Are you a writer?" Ethan hesitated. The word felt heavy, almost foreign. I used to be." The old man chuckled. "Once a writer, always a writer." He reached under the counter and pulled out a worn notebook. "I've owned this shop for 30 years. Do you know how many struggling writers have walked through that door?" Ethan shook his head. "Too many to count," the man continued. "Some gave up. Some kept going. The ones who kept going, well, they're the ones whose books you see on those shelves now." Ethan's gaze traveled across the bookshelves again. He thought about the countless nights he had spent writing, the rejection emails, the stories that no one had read. He had convinced himself that failure was permanent, but was it? The old man smiled knowingly. "Let me tell you something, son. The difference between those who succeed and those who don't is simple. The ones who succeed are the ones who refuse to quit." Ethan swallowed hard. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "You don't fail until you stop trying." For the first time in months, a spark of hope ignited in his chest. Maybe his journey wasn't over yet. Maybe, just maybe, he still had a story left to tell. Ethan sat at his tiny apartment desk, staring at the blank page on his laptop screen. The old man's words from the bookstore echoed in his mind. The ones who succeed are the ones who refuse to quit. For 5 years, he had poured his soul into his writing, only to be met with rejection after rejection. He had convinced himself that failure was inevitable, that his dream was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. But now something inside him refused to accept that. He took a deep breath and placed his fingers on the keyboard. The familiar clacking of the keys filled the silence of his room like the rhythm of a heartbeat. "This time I won't stop. This time I'll keep going." As he typed, memories surfaced. Late nights fueled by coffee. Characters that had lived in his mind, stories he had once believed in. He had lost faith in himself, but deep down, his passion had never truly died. It had only been buried beneath self-doubt and fear. For hours, he wrote, letting the words flow without overthinking. It wasn't about perfection, it was about momentum. He was no longer waiting for inspiration, he was creating it. When the sun peeked through the blinds, Ethan leaned back in his chair. His fingers ached, his eyes burned, but he felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. He had written the first chapter of a new story, one that felt alive, one that mattered. But writing was only the first step. He knew he needed to face his biggest enemy: rejection. With a determined breath, he opened his email and pulled up the list of publishers he had given up on. His heart pounded as he composed a submission email. The fear was still there, whispering doubts, reminding him of past failures, but this time he silenced it. With one final deep breath, he pressed send. Days passed, then a week. Ethan continued writing, refusing to let uncertainty paralyze him. But deep down, he couldn't stop the nagging thoughts. What if they reject me again? Then one evening, as he sat at his desk, his phone buzzed. An email notification. His hands trembled as he opened it. The words blurred for a moment, but then one sentence stood out. "We would love to discuss publishing your manuscript." Ethan blinked, rereading the sentence over and over. His breath hitched. His heart raced. He had done it. For the first time in years he had broken through, not because he was the best writer, not because he had never failed, but because he had refused to quit. And this was only the beginning. Ethan stared at the email, his heart hammering so loudly he could barely hear his own thoughts. He read the words again, afraid they would vanish like a cruel trick of the mind. "We would love to discuss publishing your manuscript." His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Should he reply now? Would waiting seem more professional? Was this even real? He stood abruptly, pacing the room. This was the moment he had been waiting for. No, the moment he had been fighting for. But doubt, that old enemy, crept in again. What if they change their mind? What if it's a mistake? Shaking his head, Ethan sat down and took a deep breath. He couldn't let fear control him anymore. He clicked reply and carefully typed a response, thanking them for the opportunity and asking about the next steps. His hands still trembled as he hit send, but this time it wasn't just fear, it was excitement. The following days were a blur. The publishing house, though small, had a strong reputation for discovering new talent. Ethan had a Zoom meeting with an editor named Claire, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense tone, but an undeniable passion for stories. "We see potential in your writing," she said, adjusting her glasses. "But there's work to do. Are you willing to rewrite certain parts?" Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely." The next few weeks tested him in ways he hadn't expected. The editor's feedback was direct, sometimes brutal, but always fair. Entire chapters had to be rewritten, some characters had to be reworked, and the pacing needed improvement. At times, Ethan felt like he was back at square one, drowning in self-doubt. One night, exhausted and frustrated, he almost closed his laptop for good. Then he remembered the bookstore owner's words: "The ones who succeed are the ones who refuse to quit." With a deep breath, he rolled his shoulders and kept writing. After weeks of revisions, the day finally came. Claire sent him the finalized contract. Ethan's hands shook as he scrolled through. It, his name, his book, in print. As he signed his name, a realization hit him. He had made it this far, not because of luck, but because he had refused to give up. And now, the real journey was about to begin. The ink on the contract had barely dried when reality set in. This was happening. His book was going to be published. For years he had imagined this moment, thinking it would bring instant relief, a sense of arrival. But now, standing at the edge of his dream, he realized the journey was far from over. The publishing house assigned him a marketing coordinator, a young and energetic woman named Ava. During their first call, she wasted no time getting to the point. "Listen, Ethan," she said, flipping through what he assumed were notes on his book. "Publishing is just the beginning. If you want this book to succeed, you'll have to put yourself out there. Interviews, social media, public readings, you need to engage with your audience." Ethan swallowed hard. Writing had always been a solitary pursuit, something he did in the quiet of his apartment, in the safety of his own mind. The idea of standing in front of people, talking about himself, made his stomach churn. I'm not really good at that kind of thing," he admitted. Ava laughed. "No author is at first, but if you want people to read your book, They need to know who wrote it. You have a story beyond the pages, Ethan. People love an underdog. Use that. Over the next few weeks, he found himself navigating an entirely new world. He created social media accounts, started sharing snippets of his writing process, and even filmed a short video introducing himself. At first, it felt unnatural, almost embarrassing. But then something unexpected happened. People started responding. Aspiring writers left comments, telling him how his journey inspired them. Some messaged him, asking for advice on handling rejection. For the first time, Ethan realized his struggles hadn't just been for himself. By pushing forward, by refusing to quit, he had created a story that others could see themselves in. But the biggest challenge was yet to come. Ava called one afternoon, excitement laced in her voice. Good news. We booked you for a speaking event at a local bookstore. You'll do a reading and answer audience questions. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Wait, what? Like in front of people? She chuckled. That is how events work, yes. Don't worry, it's a small venue. Just a few dozen people. You'll be fine. But Ethan wasn't fine. The thought of standing in front of an audience, reading his own words, made his pulse race. He wanted to back out, to make an excuse. Then he thought about all the times he had doubted himself, all the moments he had wanted to give up. If he had listened to fear before, he never would have gotten this far. So, with a deep breath, he said, "Okay, I'll do it." As the event date approached, his nerves only grew. He practiced reading aloud, stood in front of his mirror rehearsing answers to possible questions, but nothing eased the tightness in his chest. The night of the event arrived too quickly. He stood behind the bookstore, gripping the pages of his book, his palms damp with sweat. The muffled chatter of the audience sent his heart into overdrive. Then the bookstore owner, the same man who had encouraged him all those months ago, peeked in. He smiled warmly. "Nervous?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "That's good," the old man said. "It means you care. Now go show them why your story matters." With those words, Ethan took a deep breath, stepped onto the small stage, and faced the crowd. The next chapter of his journey was about to begin. Ethan gripped the edges of the podium, his pulse hammering in his ears. The crowd in the bookstore wasn't massive, maybe 30 people, but to him it felt like 1,000. Some leaned forward in their chairs, eyes filled with curiosity. Others held notebooks, perhaps aspiring writers themselves. The bookstore lights cast a warm glow over the shelves, the scent of old paper filling the air. He swallowed hard and glanced down at the copy of his book in his hands. His throat felt dry. What if they don't like it? What if I mess up? The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Then he remembered the old man's words. "It means you care." Ethan exhaled slowly, steadied himself, and began to read. His voice wavered. At first, barely above a whisper. But as the words flowed, something changed. He wasn't just reading. He was telling a story. The same story he had spent years fighting for. The same story that had almost been abandoned in moments of doubt. He reached the end of the passage and looked up. The room was silent, not the kind of silence filled with disinterest, but the kind that hung in the air when people were truly listening. Then applause. Soft at first, then growing stronger, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had done it. The bookstore owner stepped forward with a smile. "That was wonderful, Ethan. Now let's take some questions." A young woman raised her hand. "How did you keep going after so much rejection?" Ethan thought about it. There had been no magic formula, no single moment that had changed everything. It had been a series of choices. The choice to keep writing, the choice to send one more email, the choice to believe in himself when no one else did. "I reminded myself why I started," he finally said. "It wasn't about success or recognition. It was about telling stories that mattered to me. Rejection hurt, but quitting would have hurt more." More hands shot up. "What was the hardest part of writing your book? Did you ever think about giving up? How do you handle self-doubt? Ethan answered each question honestly. He admitted his struggles, his moments of near surrender, but he also shared his victories, the little ones that had added up, the lessons he had learned through persistence. As the event wrapped up, people lined up to get their book signed. Some thanked him for his words. Others shared their own dreams, their own fears. As he signed the last book, the bookstore owner patted his shoulder. You see, your story doesn't just belong to you anymore. It belongs to them too. Ethan smiled. For the first time, he truly understood. This was bigger than just a book. This was proof that perseverance mattered, that dreams were worth fighting for, and deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Ethan stepped out of the bookstore into the crisp night air, his heart still pounding. The event had gone better than he ever imagined. He had faced his fear, stood before a crowd, and shared his journey. But more than that, he had connected with people, real people, who saw something in his story that resonated with them. As he walked home, his phone buzzed. A text from Ava. Amazing job tonight. Social media is lighting up. People are posting about your reading. You're making waves, Ethan. He blinked at the screen. His first instinct was disbelief. Me? Making waves? The old version of himself, the one who had hesitated, who had almost given up, would have dismissed the idea. But tonight, something had shifted. Maybe, just maybe, he was capable of more than he had allowed himself to believe. The next morning, he woke up to notifications flooding his phone. Messages from aspiring writers, emails from small bloggers wanting to interview him, and a growing number of followers on his social media accounts. It was overwhelming, but also thrilling. Then came an email from Claire, his editor. Claire, your book is selling faster than expected. We need to discuss next steps. Call me when you can. Ethan's fingers trembled as he dialed her number. You're doing well, Ethan, Claire said the moment she picked up. Better than any of us anticipated. Sales are climbing steadily, and word of mouth is working in your favor. We need to capitalize on this momentum. Ethan sat up straighter. What do you mean? We want you to start working on your next book, she said. Readers are responding to your story, and we believe you have more to say. Do you? Did he? He had spent so long thinking about this book, about this struggle, that he hadn't even considered what came next. But now, as he thought about it, an idea sparked in his mind. Not just any idea. A story that had been forming in the back of his mind for months, waiting for its moment. Yes, Ethan said, confidence growing in his voice. I do. Good, Claire replied. Then let's get to work. Ethan hung up, staring at his laptop. A new journey was about to begin, one filled with new challenges, new fears, and new obstacles. But this time, he wasn't afraid, because he had learned something powerful along the way. Success wasn't about never failing, it was about never quitting. With a deep breath, he opened a fresh document and began to write. The blank page stared back at Ethan, a vast expanse of possibility and pressure. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Starting a new book should have felt exhilarating, but instead it felt terrifying. What if the first one was just luck? What if I can't do it again? He pushed the doubts aside. He had been here before, at the beginning of something uncertain, something daunting, and he had pushed through. He took a deep breath and typed the first sentence. Hours passed in a blur. He was no longer in his apartment, no longer in the world of self-doubt. He was inside the story, living and breathing with his new characters. When he finally surfaced from the writing trance, it was nearly 3 a.m. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. 500 words? Not much, but it was a start. The next few weeks became a familiar rhythm. Writing in the mornings, social media updates in the afternoons, occasional interviews, and late-night brainstorming sessions. His first book continued to gain traction, and Ava worked tirelessly to secure more events and opportunities. One day she called him, her voice practically vibrating with excitement. Ethan, listen, there's a huge literary festival happening next month, and we managed to get you a panel spot. You'll be speaking alongside established authors. This is big." His stomach clenched. "A panel? Like in front of hundreds of people?" "Yes, exactly," Ava said. "And before you panic, remember, you've already done this. You've spoken in front of crowds. You can handle this." He wanted to argue, to find an excuse, but deep down he knew she was right. "I'll do it," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. As the festival approached, nerves built inside him like a storm. This wasn't just a bookstore event. This was a stage, with cameras, with seasoned authors who had been doing this for years. But when the day arrived, something unexpected happened. As he sat on the panel, listening to the other authors speak about their journeys, he realized something. They had all been where he was once, unsure, full of doubt, wondering if they were good enough. When it was his turn to speak, he took a deep breath and told the truth. "I never thought I'd be here," he admitted. "I faced more rejection than I can count. I almost gave up more than once. But I kept going, not because I was confident, but because I refused to let fear win." The audience was silent, hanging on to his words, and in that moment, Ethan understood something. It wasn't about how many books he sold. It wasn't about becoming the best writer in the world. It was about showing others that dreams, no matter how impossible they seem, are worth chasing. The applause that followed wasn't just for his words, it was for the journey, and it was only the beginning. Ethan left the stage feeling lighter than he had in years. The roaring applause, the nods of recognition from fellow authors, it all felt surreal. He had once dreamed of simply being published, of seeing his book on a shelf. Now he was here, speaking on a stage, his words inspiring others. As he stepped backstage, Ava greeted him with a beaming smile. "That was incredible, Ethan. People are really connecting with your story." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I was terrified up there." She laughed. "No one could tell. You owned that stage." Before he could respond, a woman in her mid-40s approached them. She was dressed sharply, with an air of quiet confidence. "Ethan Carter?" she asked, extending a hand. "Yes," he said, shaking it. "I'm Vanessa Mills, a literary agent. I've been following your rise, and I have to say you're doing something special. The way you connect with readers, it's rare." Ethan felt a flicker of disbelief. "I appreciate that," she smiled. "I won't take up too much of your time, but I'd love to sit down with you and discuss your future. I believe you have more than one great book in you. I'd like to help take your career to the next level." Ethan blinked. I already have a publisher," Vanessa nodded, "and they're doing great work with your debut. But if you want to expand, if you want to reach an even bigger audience, there are other avenues to explore. Film rights, international releases, larger deals. Think about it. Here's my card." She handed him a sleek black business card before walking away, leaving Ethan standing there, his mind racing. Ava nudged him. "That's a big deal, Ethan. She reps some major authors." He turned the card over, in his fingers. A year ago, he had been sending desperate query emails to agents like her, hoping for a chance. Now, they were coming to him. It was overwhelming, exciting, terrifying, but above all, it was proof that he had broken through. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The question lingered in his mind. What do I do next? He already knew the answer. He had come too far to stop now. So, the next morning, he sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and got back to work, writing the next chapter, not just of his book, but of his life. Ethan threw himself into his work, pouring every ounce of energy into his new book. He wrote with a newfound confidence, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The pressure was there. This time, people had expectations, but he refused to let it paralyze him. Days turned into weeks, and before he knew it, he had a first draft. It was rough, messy, and far from perfect. But it was there. It existed. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. The first book had taken years. This one had come. Together in months, Ava called that evening. "How's the writing coming?" "I just finished the first draft," he admitted. "You what?" she nearly shouted. Ethan, that's incredible, he chuckled. It's a long way from done, but yeah, it's a start. More than a start, she said. You? No, your first book just hit the bestseller list. Ethan froze. Wait, what? The bestseller list, Ava repeated, enunciating each word. You did it. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The bestseller list. The dream that had once felt so distant, so impossible, and now it was real. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the moment sink in. He thought back to all the nights spent doubting himself, all the rejection emails, all the times he had considered giving up, and yet here he was. Ava, he said, his voice quiet, we're just getting started, aren't we? She laughed. Oh, absolutely. Ethan hung up and stared at his laptop screen. The journey had been long, and he knew there were still challenges ahead. But now he wasn't just surviving in the world of writing. He was thriving. With a deep breath, he opened his manuscript and began revising. Months passed in a blur of deadlines, edits, and events. Ethan's new book was steadily taking shape, each revision bringing it closer to something that felt right. But as the release date drew near, a new sense of unease began to settle in. What if it didn't live up to expectations? What if the pressure from his first success was too much? He found himself staring at the manuscript late one night, mind racing. He had poured everything into this book, his heart, his soul, his energy, but there was still a nagging doubt at the back of his mind. What if this time the story doesn't connect? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. He had come too far to turn back now. Still, doubt lingered like a shadow, quietly growing in the background. The next morning, he met Ava at a cafe. She immediately noticed the strain on his face. You okay? She asked, sipping her coffee. Ethan sighed. I don't know. It's like the closer I get to finishing this book, the more terrified I feel. What if it's not good enough? What if people don't like it? Ava set her cup down, her expression softening. Ethan, listen to me. The first book wasn't perfect. You're not perfect. No book is, but your story, your honesty. People connect with that, and that's what they're going to see in your next book. He leaned back, staring out the window. But what if it's not enough? What if the world moves on and forgets about me? Ava's gaze softened even further. No one's going to forget you, Ethan. Not as long as you keep writing. You're not defined by a single book or a single moment of success. You're defined by the work you do and the stories you tell. Her words sank in, and slowly, Ethan began to breathe a little easier. She was right. He couldn't control everything, reviews, sales, the world's opinion, but he could keep creating. He could keep writing. It was all he had ever wanted to do. Thanks, he said quietly, feeling the weight on his shoulders lighten. No problem, Ava said with a smile. Now, enough of this doubt. You've got a book to finish. That afternoon, Ethan returned to his desk, determined. He opened his manuscript, read through the pages, and saw it. The heart of the story. The reason he had written it in the first place. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about sharing something meaningful, something that mattered to him, and that was enough. The next day, he sent the final draft to Claire. He didn't wait for approval or praise. He simply trusted that his work was ready, even if it wasn't perfect. He had come a long way, and he had done everything he could, and when the book was finally released, it soared, not because it was flawless, but because it was real. Ethan had learned that the greatest success wasn't the accolades, the awards, or the bestseller lists. It was the quiet moment when you could look at your work and say, I did my best, and that's enough. The rest, it was all a bonus. The release of Ethan's second book came and went in a whirlwind. Sales exceeded expectations, and the praise from critics and readers alike flooded in. But amidst all the success, Ethan felt a sense of calm he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the fame or the recognition or the number of books sold that brought him peace. It was the quiet certainty that he was doing what he was meant to do. He had been to the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, and somehow he had weathered them, both Each setback, each rejection, each failure had been stepping stones on the path to this moment, the moment when he no longer doubted his place in the world of writing. But even with all that, something in him still yearned for more. Ethan had always been driven by a need for progress, a desire to challenge himself. The success of his second book was fulfilling, yes, but it also ignited a new hunger in him. What more could he do? What else could he offer? The question lingered, and in his quiet moments it gnawed at him. He had conquered the world of novels. He had proven himself. But now he was thinking bigger. It wasn't long before he received a call that would change the course of his journey once again. "Ethan," Claire said, her voice filled with excitement, "I've got something big for you. There's a film studio interested in adapting your first book." Ethan sat up straight, his heart pounding in his chest. "Wait, what? A film? My book?" "Yes, they love your story, and they want to turn it into a movie. This could be huge." A movie! The thought was surreal. He had always imagined his stories on paper, in the minds of readers, but the idea of them coming to life on a screen was entirely different. It was the kind of opportunity that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "I need time to think about it," Ethan said, his voice shaky with the weight of the decision. "I get it," Claire said, "but don't wait too long. This could be your next big step." He hung up the phone and stared out the window, the city lights blinking below him. He had spent so many years focused on the written word, on building a career as a novelist, that he had never considered the possibility of expanding his reach. The idea of a film, of his story being shared in a new way, was both exciting and overwhelming. But one thing was clear. This was the challenge he had been waiting for. In the days that followed, Ethan weighed his options. He discussed it with Ava, with Claire, with close friends. The idea of seeing his characters on screen was intoxicating, but the reality of adapting his work into something visual, something entirely different, was daunting. But just like every other fear he had faced, he knew he had to confront this one too. And so he made the decision. He would do it. He would trust the process, trust his story, and take the leap into something new. The call went out to the studio, and just like that, Ethan Carter was on the precipice of a new adventure, one where words were transformed into images, where the limits of his imagination could be pushed even further. With a deep breath, he picked up his pen once more, not just for a book, but for something bigger, something he had never imagined. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan realized that there was no end to the journey. It was just a series of new beginnings. The film project took off faster than Ethan had ever expected. Within weeks, he was meeting with producers, screenwriters, and directors, each eager to bring his novel to life in a new form. The whirlwind of meetings, calls, and creative discussions felt like a dream. Ethan had never imagined his work would have such an impact, but now the world was seeing his story through an entirely different lens. As exhilarating as it was, there were moments when Ethan felt overwhelmed by the scale of it all. The process of adapting a book into a film wasn't easy. Ideas that had worked perfectly on the page didn't always translate well to the screen. Ethan found himself sitting in brainstorming sessions, watching as his carefully crafted scenes morphed into something entirely new, something bigger. At times, he questioned whether this was the right move. His novel, his words, had meant everything to him, and now they were being shaped by others. Was this still his story, or was it becoming something else entirely? But as the project moved forward, he started to see it differently. The transformation wasn't a loss, it was an evolution. His story, his characters, were being given a chance to grow and reach new audiences. His voice wasn't being silenced, it was being amplified. One evening, after a particularly long meeting with the director, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the glow of his laptop screen the only light in the room. He reviewed the notes from the day, trying to make sense of the changes, the rewrites. For the first time in a while, the pressure felt almost unbearable. Was this what I wanted, he thought, to hand my work over to someone else? But then he remembered. He had once been at the bottom of this journey, sending out queries, waiting for a break. He had clawed his way up from the depths of self-doubt and rejection. This film project was another step, another opportunity to expand, to push beyond what he thought was possible. He took a deep breath and closed his laptop. This was just another challenge, another moment where he would rise above the fear, the uncertainty, and trust in the process. The next day, he arrived at the set for the first time. The hustle and bustle of the crew, the sound of cameras being adjusted, the actors rehearsing their lines. It was a world so different from the quiet solitude of writing, yet it was just as alive. Ethan was in awe of the way his words were being brought to life. The characters he had created years ago were now real, living, breathing, and speaking on screen. It was magical. He watched as the actors took their marks, delivering lines he had once written in the quiet of his apartment, and suddenly, the weight of the journey he had taken hit him all at once. This wasn't just about books. This wasn't just about one success. This was about something bigger, a life built on creation, on sharing his stories with the world in every possible way. By the end of the day, as he walked off the set, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace. He had come full circle, from the young man hunched over a laptop questioning his worth, to a successful novelist, a speaker, and now a part of something larger than himself. And yet, he knew there was always more stories to tell, more challenges to face, more worlds to build. This film was just the beginning of the next chapter. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready for it. The journey, after all, never truly ends. It only shifts. And Ethan was prepared to embrace whatever came next. As the weeks passed, the excitement of seeing his novel take shape on the big screen didn't wear off. But the process was far from simple. The film industry, with its fast-paced schedules and countless moving parts, was a world Ethan had never truly understood until now. He often found himself in meetings with actors, producers, and editors, each of them asking him to make decisions about things he'd never thought about: how a scene would look, how a character would be portrayed, how the music would shape the tone of the film. Some days he felt lost. There were moments when the noise of it all drowned out his own thoughts, and he had to step back and remind himself of why he was here. This wasn't just about a movie. It was about pushing the boundaries of what he could do. It was about being open to something new. He had come this far by embracing the unknown, so why stop now? One evening, while on a rare break, Ethan walked through the set's outdoor courtyard, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He thought about the story that had started as nothing more than an idea in his head, and now it was becoming a living, breathing piece of art. The characters he had created, the world he had built, were now in the hands of talented filmmakers who were adding their own magic to it. It was humbling. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Ethan, there you are." He turned to see Ava approaching, a wide smile on her face. She had been supportive of the film project from the beginning, but seeing her here, on set, felt like a different kind of support, one that was tangible. "I've been following the progress. It's incredible, Ethan. The buzz is unbelievable." Ethan smiled but couldn't shake the feeling of unease he had been carrying. "Yeah, it's been amazing. But there are days when it feels like everything's out of my control. I wrote the story, but now I'm watching it evolve into something I didn't quite anticipate." Ava placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and reassuring. "That's the beauty of it, Ethan. You created something, and now you're letting others bring their perspective to it. It's not a loss. It's an expansion, just like how your writing has expanded over the years." Her words grounded. him. She was right. This was just another way for his story to live, to grow. I guess I'm just still learning how to navigate it all, he admitted. The expectations, the changes. It's a lot. You've been navigating new territory from the moment you started writing, she reminded him. This is just a new chapter, with new lessons. Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of her words settle within him. She had been there from the beginning, the one who always reminded him that every step forward was a victory, no matter how big or small. Thanks, Ava. I needed to hear that, she grinned. You'll do great. Just remember why you started in the first place. And with that, Ethan found the peace he needed. This journey wasn't just about the accolades or the projects. It was about the stories he could share, the impact he could have, and the way he could connect with others through his words. The film wasn't just the next step in his career. It was a reminder of how far he had come and how far he could still go. As the production of the movie moved forward, Ethan started to embrace it more fully. The doubts faded, replaced by a quiet certainty that he was where he was meant to be. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always glamorous. But it was his journey, and he was living it with everything he had. And as the final scenes of the movie were shot, Ethan realized that the journey would never truly end. It would evolve, twist, and turn, but he was ready for whatever came next. With a heart full of gratitude and a mind open to the future, Ethan continued down the path he had carved. For himself, a path filled with stories, challenges, and endless possibilities. The film's premiere arrived faster than Ethan had anticipated. He had seen the trailers, the posters, the buzz on social media, but nothing compared to the rush of sitting in that theater, surrounded by hundreds of people, waiting for his story to unfold on the screen. He had always imagined how his words would sound when spoken aloud, how his characters would look. But now, it was real. It was happening. The lights dimmed, and the opening credits rolled. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the familiar scenes from his book played out on the big screen. His words, once written in isolation, now took on a new life in front of an audience. His characters, his world, everything he had poured himself into, it was all there, larger than life. For the first time, Ethan understood the power of collaboration. The actors, the director, the crew, they had all breathed new life into his work, interpreting it in ways he had never imagined. And while some of the changes had been difficult to accept, the result was undeniable. The film was magnificent. He watched as the audience reacted, gasping in surprise, laughing at the right moments, even crying in the most emotional scenes. The connection was palpable. It wasn't just his story anymore, it was everyone's story. And that, Ethan realized, was the most beautiful part of the whole journey. When the credits rolled, a wave of applause swept through the theater. Ethan sat still for a moment, allowing the moment to wash over him. He had spent so much time questioning whether he was enough, whether his work would resonate with people. And now, here he was, watching his story touch the lives of strangers in a way he could never have imagined. After the screening, there was a reception. Ethan stood by the refreshment table, talking to industry people, reporters, and friends. His phone buzzed constantly with messages and notifications. His novel, his book, was now a part of something bigger. People were talking about it, sharing it, celebrating it, and in that moment, he realized something profound. This wasn't just about him anymore. It had never truly been about him. It had always been about the stories he told, the stories he heard, and the connections those stories created. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself standing in a quiet corner, taking it all in. He had been so focused on his career, on the next book, the next challenge, that he hadn't allowed himself to truly savor the moments along the way. The journey had been everything, and yet there was still so much more to come. The next morning, he woke to a flurry of emails and calls. The success of the film had opened doors to new opportunities, interviews, collaborations, speaking engagements. It felt overwhelming, but in the best possible way. Ethan was no longer just a writer. He was a part of a larger conversation, one that would continue to evolve in ways he had never expected. But amidst it all, he knew he had to stay grounded. He couldn't lose sight of what mattered, the stories, the craft, the heart of it all. He had started this journey because he had something to say, and as long as he kept that at the center of everything, the path ahead would remain clear. The success of the film was a milestone, but it was not the end. It was just another chapter. And Ethan knew that as long as he kept telling his stories, as long as he kept pushing himself to grow, the journey would never stop. There would always be new challenges, new risks, and new ways to share his work with the world. And with that, Ethan took another step forward, knowing that, no matter what came next, he was ready. Months passed, and the film continued to receive accolades. It wasn't just the critical success that made Ethan proud, though. It was the conversations it sparked, the way people connected with the characters, the themes, and the struggles that had once only lived in the quiet corners of his mind. His story had transcended the written word, becoming a shared experience that lived on in the hearts of those who watched it. The success was undeniable, and yet Ethan couldn't help but feel the pull of something deeper. He had conquered this chapter, but he was not content to rest. He had built a career on perseverance, on refusing to accept limitations, and now he felt more determined than ever to push beyond what he thought was possible. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, surrounded by notes for his next book, a new idea began to take root in his mind. It wasn't like any other idea he had had before. This time, the concept wasn't tied to the past or anything he had already written. It was something entirely new, something raw. He found himself sketching out ideas for a novel that would stretch his limits in ways he hadn't considered. This wasn't just about writing. It was about exploring new themes, new forms of storytelling, and pushing himself into uncharted territory. This was the challenge he had been waiting for. He worked tirelessly, day and night, the words flowing from his mind like they had never done before. It was as if the success of the film, the connections he had made, and the journey he had taken had unlocked something inside him, something he didn't even know existed. He was writing with a new sense of freedom, a new sense of urgency. As he continued to write, the world outside continued to change, but Ethan was consumed by the creative process. He was no longer just trying to make a name for himself. He wasn't writing for validation or for the accolades. He was writing because he had something to say, something that had been waiting inside him for years. One evening, as he read through the manuscript of his new book, Ethan smiled to himself. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was his, and that, he realized, was enough. In the quiet stillness of his room, with the soft hum of the city in the background, Ethan made a promise to himself. No matter where the journey took him, no matter what successes or setbacks came his way, he would always keep pushing forward. He would always keep writing, because the true beauty of the journey wasn't in the destination. It was in the act of creation itself. And as long as he could create, he would never stop. He was ready for the next chapter, whatever it may bring, because the journey, as he now knew, never truly ended. It was a continuous unfolding, a never-ending story. And for the first time, Ethan was content to simply live it.